Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast delving into issues affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our monthly conversation with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Let me just remind our listeners, Ahmed is the head of Realign For Palestine, which is an Atlantic Council project that challenges entrenched narratives in the Israel and Palestinian discourse. So, Ahmed, thank you so much for joining me once again.
Thank you so much for talking to me. Excited to be here again.
I am so excited, and we have for our listeners 5 potential scenarios for the Gaza Strip for 2026. And we also have a few listener questions that we're going to ask at the very end. So, all of this and more when we're back.
Over 2,000 years ago, the Hanukkah flame burned against all odds, a symbol of resilience and hope that still shines brightly today. Now, Israel once again turns to light, not just to remember, but to protect and rebuild. As the country rises from 2 years of war, the Technion's brightest minds are leading the way, revitalizing the economy, strengthening national security, and shaping a future full of promise. This Hanukkah, we honor the Technion minds who bring light to the darkness, in our labs, on our front lines, and in our hearts. May the light of innovation illuminate every corner of Israel, heralding a new era of strength and renewal.
And we're back. I am Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Now, Ahmed, before we hit the 5 scenarios, which are just super fascinating, and we're going to go through them one by one, I have a question for you that I keep asking our military correspondent, Emmanuel Fabian. And every day we see Gazans trying to cross the yellow line, the line that divides between the Hamas-ruled section of the Gaza Strip and the Israeli-controlled section. And pretty much every day we see Gazans trying to cross it, and unfortunately, they're usually shot and killed. So my question for you, in your estimation, why are the Gazans attempting to cross the line?
So there's several possibilities. Most likely, some of those folks are trying to get to what remains of what were once their communities, their homes, their belongings are there, their assets, maybe their cars, maybe their jewelry, maybe their beds, their sheets, their clothes. There's also a possibility that some folks are trying to get away from Hamas. Maybe some people are thinking that if they can enter the Israeli-controlled area, this could amount to some level of asylum seeking, if you want. I have seen some chatter on Arabic social media, on Facebook in particular, in which people discuss and describe how they're so desperate to leave Gaza, leave the desperation, leave the tents, leave the cold weather, leave the devastation, if you will, and the hopelessness that has set in by exiting the Hamas-controlled area and going to the IDF zones in anticipation of what could be the arrival of the international forces, in anticipation of what could be the partition of East and Western Gaza. And so, and then finally, there's some nebulous nature to the way in which the line is created and the way the line is drawn. And we've seen those yellow bricks and concrete blocks, if you will. But sometimes it's as simple as people don't, like there isn't a very consistent demarcation of the yellow line across residential areas where it cuts through. And so sometimes people just simply don't know where it runs in, and they risk crossing in thinking that I'm going to go in 100 meters or 500 meters or 200 meters, hoping to get to what remains of my home or to acquire something or another.
Okay, you've definitely touched on the devastation and the hopelessness. And of course, the weather is just terrible. It's really cold. And we had a winter storm that was devastating, definitely flooding everywhere. And that's mostly, of course, in the Hamas-controlled sections of the Gaza Strip. Hamas is deeply rooted, it appears to me, in 47% of the Gaza Strip, and Israel controls about 53%. But in terms of the population spread, what, 95% or more is in the Hamas-controlled area. And can you tell me a little bit about those who live in the section that Israel is in control of?
So that's a really fascinating point, particularly because I've been trying to research that consistently. And quite honestly, the only thing that I've been able to come across in terms of a hard evidence for who lives in the Israeli controlled zones are those belonging to the patchwork of anti-Hamas militias. There are an estimated four or four and a half, if you will, of them. There are a couple of them in Khan Yunis, and then there's the now the popular forces that were once commanded by Abu Shabab, who was killed in an internal dispute. And then there's one in Shajaiya and one in Beit Hanun. But the idea being that other than these individuals and elements of their families and elements of a small number of the people of Gaza who flee the West and go into these territories, the IDF is very restrictive about new arrivals into these zones and territories. And so unless you were there during the war, really, when the separation happened, when the division of Gaza happened, the IDF isn't really allowing new arrivals. So it's mainly those who belong to the militias as well as their families and their communities, which my estimation is that they're really not more than 2 to 3,000 at most.
Wow. So that would mean something like 99% of the population or more is under Hamas rule. And in our previous conversation, we talked about how much of the population does not accept Hamas rule. They do not want Hamas rule, but it is there and it seems immovable at this point. So let's go through some of the scenarios that you've charted out so really concisely on social media more than anything. And I'd like to take us through them point by point. So, point number one, I found perhaps the most intriguing and improbable, in my opinion. And
Mhm.
it is a mutiny from Hamas's ranks within Gaza. So, tell me why you think this is a likely scenario.
Certainly. And I didn't put forth these scenarios necessarily in the rank of likely to least likely or most likely. Nevertheless, the idea is that, I mean, we've not really seen, with the exception of a few cases throughout its 37 years of existence, in which some elements of Hamas have split and formed more hardcore jihadi, ISIS, Al Qaeda like cells. We've not really seen any. Hamas has had this incredible cohesion to it that we really haven't, I think, seen in many other elements of the Palestinian um, political scene or armed factions. I mean, Fatah has had a lot of splits, and so has the PFLP and the different secular and Marxist groups, and so one of the things that I have long wondered about as a consequence of this war is the separation between Hamas's leadership abroad and Hamas's masses and elements in the West Bank and elsewhere versus Hamas's kind of hardcore legions, if you will, in the Gaza Strip. And I think because the smuggling has been pretty much stopped, if not reduced to a mere trickle in some of the pallets of the goods coming in through Kerem Shalom crossing, the fact that the financing of the terror group is in shambles. Yes, Hamas is taxing commercial trucks at 50%. There are an estimated 5 to 600 trucks entering Gaza every day. of those, about 150, these are all estimates, about 150 are for humanitarian goods and supplies by international NGOs. And then the rest are for commercial goods. These are belonging to merchants, to businessmen. And each truckload, I should say, is taxed at 50% by Hamas. And that's for protection and mafia-like, like just dues, if you will. And so that has replenished Hamas's empty coffers. Nevertheless, that's still not enough to really restore the October 6th level cash reserves that Hamas required to pay its employees, the government, and to pay the salary of fighters. There are varying estimates that Hamas right now is paying between $25 to $35 per day for its fighters, depending on experience. And so when you take that into the picture, when you take the deep demoralization of its own fighters, I mean, Hamas is effectively using child soldiers right now, and is using teenagers, and you can see in some of the way they look emaciated, they look young and skinny, and they don't look like the intimidating figures that they once did before October 7th. When you look at just the sheer misery surrounding Gaza, these people know how deeply unpopular and unliked they are, notwithstanding some elements of the Palestinian society and their families. The totality of the aforementioned, I think, is going to potentially come to a head if there is no resolution to the misery, if there is no phase two, if there's no progress, if they're living on basically crumbs, if you will, in terms of payments, in terms of financial support, in terms of humanitarian aid. And I mean, $30 in a highly inflated war-like economy is not
So
exactly a whole lot of
just
money.
a question on that, actually, Ahmed. So $30 in India would buy you quite a lot. You could live pretty well on $30 a day, but $30 in Gaza buys you what? Meaning
It's
how
roughly
much is
110 shekels, about 100. Let's say it's 100 shekels, roughly. And so, the prices have gone down significantly after the ceasefire. But if you're supporting a family, if you don't have a home, if transportation alone, whether you're using a tuk-tuk, a donkey cart, or a taxi or a vehicle, between the cost of transportation, between the cost of food, between the cost of accessing basic things like water and hygiene, that is an incredibly expensive proposition for one person, let alone if you're using that to support your uh, parents, your family, your siblings, if you have children, etc. So while I can't provide you with a particular shopping list, I can assure you that 100 shekels in Gaza is not going to truly buy you very much. Now, there are people who have access to a greater number of, or a greater amount of money through electronic means, the Bank of Palestine or the Arab Bank, people who use the applications, electronic banking as opposed to cash. Hamas is running almost entirely, for the most part, on a cash operation. Whereas other parts of like folks who work for NGOs, folks who work for foreign governments or entities, folks who before the war had bank accounts and can have others from the outside world deposit funds into those bank accounts. So that's where I think there's a difference, where a lot of the Hamas members and fighters in particular are heavily disadvantaged when it comes to electronic banking. So again, the idea of me saying that they'll potentially have a mini mutiny of a sort, or a separation, or that they'll go rogue against Hamas's leadership, isn't so much that they'll all of a sudden turn Zionist or love Israel overnight. That's not it. What I'm saying is that the multi-layers of hardships and misery and suffering, partly brought on by their own actions, but also by their leadership, which they're looking at Hamas abroad. They're looking at Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood networks abroad. They're looking at the hundreds of millions, the billions that were raised on the back of Gaza. And they're realizing we're living on crumbs here and we're being left to fend for ourselves. And so they might very well have a pivotal role in 2026 in terms of destabilizing the command structure of what remains of Hamas in Gaza.
Okay, great. So let's turn to the second point that you raise, and it's a significant rise and empowerment of anti-Hamas militias in different sectors of the Gaza Strip. And in the beginning, you mentioned that there are four, maybe four and a half of these, and especially since the death of Abu Shabab, his militia is probably in tatters by this point. So I just wonder, where do you see the strength in these militias? Where are they physically, and how can they actually be empowered?
Well, actually, just starting with the point on Abu Shabab, I would actually argue the opposite. Since the death of Abu Shabab, the Ghassan Dehane, the current leader of the group, is actually who is the head of operations, is a far more successful operational and tactical leader of the group. Since he took over, you can see the standardization of their uniforms. Everyone has these sleek black uniforms that are tactical gear, all uniform helmets. They recently just uncovered a bunch of RPGs that have dual heads, many of them. And these are either seized from Lebanon or seized from Gaza. Clearly, the Israeli military and government are giving them support. You've seen them engage in some high-profile assassinations against members of Hamas in Gaza. So I would argue that actually, since his assassination, the group is come under the command of somebody who is a lot more ruthless than Yasser. Yasser was very much so. Um, he he was a symbolic leader. He broke through a glass ceiling of normalizing the act of working under the Israeli military, etc. Um, not caring about being called a collaborator, but also he had an unsavory background, and so does Dehaney, who comes from, based on a lot of available information, an adjacent jihadi background, if you will, that rejected that background and has since taken on a very anti-Hamas ethos that's not just against the group itself, but against the ideology and against extremism, etc. Remains to be seen. I've actually interviewed him a couple of times, and the the way he presents is very much so against ideologies and against extremism, and one that commits to submitting to the will of the international committee, uh, the international community, rather, once there's an international peacekeeping force in their stabilization force.
Okay, that is super interesting. And obviously, in Syria, we see a model for a former jihadi leader who has come good, shall we say. Who knows if that will happen in Gaza? And it's really interesting what you're saying about this new leader being more effective than Yasser, who is obviously really charismatic. And so I just assumed that once the charisma was gone, once the riz was gone, that the group would fall apart. But what you're saying is actually quite fascinating. And so the question is, how many members are there? What kind of strength do they have?
So these guys right now have I would estimate probably 500 members. Just this one particular militia alone. There's probably cumulatively anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 that these militias have maximum. Now that doesn't mean they're all combat effective, but what I think is different here is that if in 2026 we see a shift in which working for these militias becomes an economic model, it becomes a source of employment, if you will, that could be something to look out for, and it could be a game changer. Number two is, now that it has become cemented that the International Stabilization Force will not fight Hamas, it will not do disarmament against the terror group, there's a gap between what was originally envisioned by President Trump and the 20 points versus where we're at right now. And so these guys may very well, especially if there is a protracted stagnation, end up being the way in which the Israelis, elements of the Arab world, the Emiratis, maybe the Jordanians and the Egyptians, maybe even the Palestinian Authority, who knows, end up actually funneling through weapons, guns, support, etc., to take on Hamas. We could see a miniaturized version of what took place against the Soviets in the 1980s. Of course, that carries all sorts of risks, but for the time being, and absent scenario one of an internal division within Hamas, I don't really see how the international community, absent also Israel going back in, I don't see how you can have an external player other than these militias actually destabilizing Hamas and taking them on. And so economic opportunity for unemployed Gazans, meaning geostrategic, geopolitical shifts and reorientations, and a desire to break the stalemate caused by the kind of the failure, if you will, of the ISF mandate, may very well make this scenario viable.
Okay, so let's turn to number 3, and this too I'm not seeing at all, and it's mass protests and large-scale uprisings against Hamas throughout the Gaza Strip by civilians. And it's kind of rare to see any kind of protest against Hamas regardless of the war. We saw a couple years ago there were some very low-level protests and people were killed, jailed, just tortured. It was terrible, obviously, for all of these activists. And so as we say in Hebrew, kal v'chomer, all the more so right now, one would assume that civilians who are just really scraping day to day, just trying to eat and stay warm and dry, how did they have the energy? How could they have the energy to stage some kind of mass protest?
So I actually see this scenario as the most likely. And I see it as the most likely probably sometime in the spring when the weather warms up. Not when it's too hot, certainly not when it's too cold right now. But the reason for that is that if the stagnation continues, and all indications point to that likelihood, I think it's very, very likely that the people of Gaza are going to be fed up and that we're going to see a scenario in which a significant number of the population starts out by demanding that Hamas step down, demanding that Hamas give up rule and control over the Gaza Strip. Then Hamas, being the cunning terror group that they are, just like they did during the war, they will co-opt these protests and they will very quickly come out and say, we demand the implementation of phase 2, open Gaza up, let Gaza live, etc. So that Hamas, my prediction, I'm looking forward to somebody coming back to this video in a few months from now saying that Hamas will very much so be able to shift the narrative, or at least will try and likely succeed in shifting the narrative and say, oh, no, these protests aren't against us. They're against the failure of the international community. Because in Gaza, for example, during the war, a couple of times, people would protest against Hamas and say, Hamas, get out, leave, and the war, get out. And then Hamas would in turn actually try to co-opt them and say, oh, yes, these protests are against the war. They're demanding the end of genocide. They're demanding that Israel be held accountable, and that this isn't about us. This doesn't mention us.
Right. Hamas is definitely master of the spin. There's no question. But I'm just wondering, what are you basing this premise on? Is it just a hunch, or do you have some kind of empirical data that people are willing to throw off Hamas? Because it just doesn't appear to be the case.
Well, protests do not mean the overthrow of Hamas, just to be deadly clear here. Like, I'm not at all suggesting that these protests will somehow result in the ending of Hamas's rule. What I'm simply suggesting is that we will yet again see physical, in your face evidence of how deeply unpopular Hamas is. One of the things that I have been trying to time and again prove, and sometimes with mixed results, is that to this very day, huge numbers of the so-called pro-Israel community, and I'm talking former army people and spokespersons and smart dudes and dudettes and intellectuals and journalists, to this day, they repeat the garbage of, well, all of Gaza's Hamas, and all Gazans are with Hamas, and Hamas didn't come out of Mars. Hamas is all supported by the people of Gaza. And despite numerous attempts to try to really show nuanced analysis and nuanced descriptions of the layers of support of Hamas and how you peel those off, and it's an onion, and there's an ideological core, and there's marginal support, and there's secondary support, and some people wanted it for jobs, and some people were pro-resistance but anti-Hamas, but then the resistance narrative is now collapsed, and the consequences of October 7th. Some people are just so caught up in the dehumanization of the people of Gaza. It's a intellectually lazy argument, you know. And it just the other day, it's like someone whom I know, and I like some of the things that he'll periodically say. Jonathan Conricus, who's former army spokesperson, and he's like, "Well, actually, I made a mistake because I tried to distinguish between Hamas and the people of Gaza." But that was a mistake. Hamas is Gaza and Gaza is Hamas. And I'm like, Jonathan, what are you doing? You're making a worse mistake by trying to say that all of Gaza is Hamas. And so, why am I saying this? This isn't just a rant. What I'm trying to say is that there are multiple windows, and this is part of my raison d'etre. This is why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, is that there are windows for separating Hamas from the population. There needs to be a physical manifestation of that with the green zone, the red zone, whatever. But that's a down the road discussion. But for the time being, socially, politically, religiously, ideologically, economically, and otherwise, there is an opportunity to use those growing fissures between Hamas and the population. And so I think that those will come to a head because the amount of misery, and I speak to Gazans on a daily basis, and I read this stuff, and I'm not just like, I'll speak to that. Like, this is my brother is there. What remains of my family is there. Like, I have an army of folks on the ground who tell me what is happening. I support a large network of people on the ground in Gaza with all sorts of means. And so that's how I get to know these sentiments. And so that's where I believe this movement will happen. How the problem is, like last time, for example, we saw the so-called pro-Palestine movement not only not support these Gazans, but actually come out against them and say they're collaborators, they're this, they're that. This is why I think large elements of the so-called pro-Palestine movement are indeed pro-Hamas, pro-terror, disgusting losers that they do not care about the Palestinian people. I do not want anything to do with them, and I don't want them anywhere near the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian issue. And so that's where I think this scenario, and again, I'm not saying I'm hoping for this scenario per se. I'm simply anticipating that the people of Gaza will have no other way of communicating this sheer anger except for some kind of demonstrations in 2026.
Okay, we are going to go to a short break and then discuss scenarios 4 and 5.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. So before we hit scenarios 4 and 5, I have just a question for you. And this is not perhaps an academic question. It's more of a feeling type question. And you right now mentioned those of the pro-Palestine community who have basically romanticized Hamas and turned them into, shall we call them, freedom fighters who should use any means necessary, including murder and rape of Israelis, etc. And I just want to ask you, in your opinion, why are people doing this? Why are they romanticizing Hamas?
Well, it's numerous threads that come together. It's ignorance. It's not knowing about Hamas. It's a popular subject right now. It's very hip and cool to be talking about this issue, talking about the Palestinian cause. It's very it has brought together multiple threads of, the post-colonial anti-Western narratives meet the poor brown people being colonized and hurt by the evil white people. It does directly or subconsciously, I think, allow for the expression of anti-Semitic sentiments. There are, of course, overt, clear anti-Semitic sentiments, but there are subconscious, Jews are in control and Jews control the money and the media and the this and the that, and the idea that somehow there's Jewish exceptionalism and only the Jews can do that. I mean, and to be clear, I will be the first to submit to you that, or to agree that there have been legitimate attempts at criticizing Israeli actions and policies that have been suppressed with faux accusations of anti-Semitism that I think were incredibly damaging and weaponized anti-Semitism. By the way, in the same way that there are faux attempts to silence legitimate critique of the Muslim Brotherhood by faux accusations of Islamophobia. That said, I think there's just a bizarre alignment on this issue between multiple unlikely allies because of the multiple threats. There's the post-colonial angle to it. There's the evil white settler narrative. And then there's this idea that the Palestinians have no agency, and so no matter what they do, they can't be at fault. They can't be held accountable, and that Hamas is somehow an expression of organic resistance to 77 years of Israeli occupation. And my thesis is that within the imbalance of power dynamics, with Israel clearly being up here and with the Palestinians being on the shorter end of this, there very much so does exist space for Palestinian agency and accountability and responsibility. And that's not blaming the victim. That's not self-hatred. That's actually the first step to empowering the Palestinian people. And I can have horrendous issues with the war conduct, with the Kahanistan government, with some of the fascist behavior of the Israeli settlers, and with the rejectionist narratives in Israeli society that want to erase the existence of the Palestinian people, without legitimizing Hamas, without surrendering that line, that agency to an Iranian Muslim Brotherhood outfit that is neither a resistance group nor a real nationalist army. It is a foreign abomination of Palestinian values. And so most of these, and it's very easy to be pro-Hamas when you're not the one that has to stand in a long line to use the dirty, disgusting bathroom with 500 other people, when you're not the one in a wet, muddy tent, when you're not the one that has to lose their loved ones. And so that, to me, is why it's like I've at first I used to believe that these folks just were genuinely misinformed. They were genuinely angry. But then it's just clear it's a combination of whataboutism. You present them with Hamas and their criminalities, and then they'll be like, well, what about the settlers in the West Bank? Well, apples and oranges. Don't talk to me about settlers in the West Bank, meaning that Gaza has to be sent to the Stone Age because of that. And so it's very, very frustrating. And I sadly only expect that trend to continue to just get worse in 2026.
Okay, so that wasn't on your list of scenarios, but I so appreciate that answer, and it's something that I've always wondered about. Now, let's turn to number 4, and that ties in very well with what you were just talking about, and that is a mass exodus of civilians from the red zone, which is controlled by Hamas behind the yellow line, into the Israeli-controlled green zone to live in caravans or mobile homes with access to services such as health and sanitation and things of that nature. And that is something that we hear about here and there, especially among the U.S. Factors in all of this ceasefire negotiations. But it's not something that has until now seemed realistic. So are you thinking that this will be some kind of coordinated mass exodus? And do you feel like the Israeli army would have to screen the individuals, which I'm sure they would want to do? How do you see this scenario playing out?
So I've been a proponent of this for the longest time. Well, for as long as we've had a ceasefire, I should say, in the sense that there needs to be a demarcation of the yellow line so that it's clear. There needs to be a clearing of all the debris, unexploded munitions, all the tunnels from the areas that the Israeli military controls. And then there needs to be the introduction of more reasonable accommodations like those caravans or mobile homes, like the actual like service centers that can provide actual free, not Hamas dominated service areas, but actual free services, aid that is equitably distributed without nepotism playing a role. I very much so support checking the people who are going into those areas with biometrics, with metal detectors. But the reason for that, and this is where the accountability on the Israeli side is necessary, and this is where the introduction of the International Stabilization Force is necessary, is to learn from the horrendous lessons from the war, in which the army would just say to people in the north, hey, everybody just head on south, and send everybody to Hamas-controlled zones, and then bombs the zones down south where Hamas was. And yes, Hamas, of course, were hiding in tents. I've had friends send me videos and pictures of Islamic Jihad head of manufacturing being 2 tents right next to them and being bombed and being hit. And at times there would be bad intelligence, but regardless, you would hit a tent and then you would burn a bunch of people alive. And it was horrendous. It was horrendous what the IDF did, and it was the worst possible strategy. And when I flew over Gaza, I saw cleared areas in the north that were sitting empty, and Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the fascists in the government were saying, no, don't let Gazans come up north because we might want to settle those areas or we want to use it as political leverage. So like the army couldn't actually fight this war without political interference, and the people of Gaza paid the ultimate price. So this strategy moving forward, and there's a scenario in which this could happen in 2026, is that there are some in Israel, in the United States, in the Civil Military Coordination Center, the CMCC, that the United States set up in Israel in Kiryat Gat, that could very much so learn those lessons and vet who's coming in. And once they're coming in, there's no going back to the red zone. And then you actually start, and once you have caravans, not tents. Once you have sewage and water and basic food and medical supplies and some resemblance of schools or learning and some, like just freedom and areas that are clear of rubble, you will absolutely, are you kidding? You will have a huge number of people from the western part, from the red Hamas-controlled area, move over. And so that's where I think we could see a mass exodus. Now, over time, I don't know that the yellow zone can necessarily, or the green zone or whatever color you give it, can necessarily accommodate the entirety of the population. But if you do it in sectors and you start focusing on southern Gaza or like the northern part of Gaza, then maybe there is a scenario in which there's a targeted clearance operation against Hamas. If you have the demarcation and you got the tunnels done, then Hamas is really confined to small areas with minimal to no civilians in the area, and then maybe it is achievable to actually defeat them militarily.
So your final proposition is kind of, in a way, the opposite of what we just discussed. And it's basically having the International Stabilization Force, the ISF, actually take up its mandate and fight Hamas and demilitarize Hamas itself. So I suppose that could be done in combination with what we just discussed, and perhaps that would be a better scenario for everyone. But it's also possible that this force would be used in, zones of conflict, meaning a bubble here and then clear Hamas from there and then increase the bubble and increase and increase and increase. And that's one of the models that some of the military people I've spoken with have talked about, to clear out Hamas from the Strip incrementally. But it doesn't appear that this ISF is going to be taking on this kind of offensive role. And we're increasingly hearing of it as more of a patrolling force of the yellow line or things of that nature, unless, of course, that weird scenario that Turkey would be involved in the ISF. And that's something that, of course, Israel would, I would assume, just veto outright. So where do you see scenario number 5 actually happening?
So it's very unlikely. However, there is a possibility that a scenario that I had spoken about, that a few other people have spoken about, can be resurrected, which is the potential use of private military contractors as the spearhead for the International Stabilization Force, such that in this incremental approach, which is ultimately the only way, even if you have the United States mighty army going in there, it's always going to be incremental no matter what. So the how is, do you have the Turkish troops? It's bizarre. Like in Miami 3-4 days ago, when the Qataris and the Turks and a bunch of other countries were there with Witkoff and others to discuss the path forward, and really nothing came out of that. It was very much so that, like, what my sources were saying is that there was a desire to have the United States put pressure on Israel to accept Turkish troops in Gaza, and that is how Hamas is willing to disarm. And the idea being that Hamas will only disarm if Turkey is there. And the Qataris basically were trying to kind of throw a tantrum, if you will, to say like, well, without this, what do you want us to do? There's nothing else we can do. And my understanding is that for the time being, the United States is not going to put pressure on Israel to accept Turkish troops. And that's why Steve Witkoff kind of came up with that no statements, nothing burger of a statement. I don't know if you saw it over the weekend, about like, oh, we hope we keep talking, and it's a whole lot of nothing. I respect Mr. Witkoff and what he's trying to do. I know this isn't entirely on him, but yeah, that was very revealing. So the
I
point
kind
being,
of read that, thinking that, of course, there's the meetup between Netanyahu and Trump coming up, next week. And I kind of read it as like, well, we don't have anything to report right now until we actually, get all sides on board. So that's putting a kindly eye on that nothing burger of a statement, perhaps.
certainly, and I'm like I said, I'm sympathetic to it's the end of the year. There's different things moving, different things not moving. Nevertheless, the major takeaway here is that I don't see the stalemate breaking. Scenarios 4 and 5 are the only true salvation for the people of Gaza, and the only way to ensure a scenario that isn't listed there, but I actually think is the kind of supreme scenario of them all, which is the return of an IDF operation against Gaza. And it may not look exactly like the war did before the ceasefire, but it will be somewhere in between where it was and where so like right now there's like the Lebanon scenario in Lebanon with the current strikes and whatever. So it's a very low intensity war, very low intensity. So it'll be like a medium intensity war in Gaza. And that's just, that's more, on the one hand, that's the only way to get rid of Hamas at that point, if nothing else works. But I mean, is it really going to actually succeed if you're just going to bomb them from the air and that's it, nothing else goes in there? So it's a mess on so many levels. And the International Stabilization Force, even if they use private contractors for phase 1, is a necessity. It's very critical. Otherwise, it's going to be the Israeli military that ultimately has to go back in there. Because I don't see a scenario unless we get Netanyahu back in as prime minister. I don't see a scenario in which Israel truly accepts a weakened, partially neutered Hamas to remain on its southern front.
Yes. So let's turn to the questions from our listeners, and please write in with more questions after this episode. I know I have 100,000 more questions, and so thank you, Ahmed, for agreeing to speak with me monthly. But let's take a question from a listener called Mark, and his question is kind of long, but hopefully not too long. It relates to the future leadership of normalized Gaza, one that practices peaceful coexistence with Israel and discards the Hamas war rhetoric. So he's asking, who are those potential leaders? Do they exist in Gaza, and where are they now?
Certainly. So if I had a penny for every time I heard that, the point being is that do they exist? Yes. Do they exist in the way that Mark is describing? No. What I mean by that is that there are people who are capable of doing such things. What doesn't exist is the environment in which they are kind of cut loose to do said things. People often, like they're like, oh, I love you, Ahmed, but I get so depressed by you. because I love you, but you're like you're like a desert, a rose in the desert, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, the goal is not for you to think of me as a novelty. There are 1,000 Ahmeds out there. They may not sound and look and speak in the mannerisms and blah, blah, blah. They may not speak English in the way that I do, but they very much so are just as capable, if not even more capable than I am, in specific lanes. These are engineers and doctors and journalists and academics, real journalists, not journalists, and folks who, if given a chance to lead and actually engage in nation building, would perform miracles and wonders. And I think, unfortunately, the biggest hindrance to their success is our own society and social fabric that has internalized a lot of this. Like, we have the lowest illiteracy ratings. We have the highest. Gaza has the highest per capita PhD rate in the entire Arab world. We have so it's not ignorance in this, or it's not a lack of education, but it's the space, it's the community, it's the culture, it's the external support. And the problem is right now, and I am really sad to share this, but it's not just an internal problem. In Washington, D.C., half of my opposition and the haters that I have, they're not even Palestinians. Like, something like 1/5 of them are leftist Jews. The rest are like academics, they're journalists, they're, some in the human rights community. I actually argue that, again, and this is where I speak about Gaza almost exclusively, because support for Hamas in the West Bank has actually increased. And I'm like, if you want to do that, have at it. You've already tasted it in Tulkarm and Tobas and Jenin and whatever, with the 40,000 expelled. I'm not saying I agree with that policy, but I'm just saying a bunch of little kids with guns got your camps destroyed, and that was just a small taste of it. If those are the games you want to play, to each their own. But my Palestine, my vision for a Palestinian state begins in Gaza. That is my community. That is my home. That is where my family is. That is where we need to and I'm a believer in Gaza first, because without Gaza, without the making up for the wasted last 20 years since the disengagement in 2005, there is no how do we make sure that the West Bank doesn't become a Gaza 2.0? And I'm not, again, saying that I want the military occupation. I'm against the occupation. I'm against the military occupation, against the settlements. But what takes their place? And so I want to be defined by what we're for, not just by what we're against. And so, in short, or in summary rather, those people do exist, and they just need a chance. And I'm confident they will rise to the occasion.
Perhaps not in short, as you said, but yes, in summary. And Ahmed, I think we have so many more issues to discuss in our next conversation, and I so look forward to it. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another episode next week. We were produced by Ari Schlacht. If you have any questions for Ahmed or comments about this or any other podcast episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.